Hello, and welcome to this session on doing the most good for animals post-COVID-19 with Lewis Bollard. Following a 15-minute talk by Lewis, we'll move on to a live Q&A session where he will respond to your questions. You can submit questions in your name or anonymously using the box to the right-hand side of this video. You can also vote for your favorite questions to push them up higher in the queue. We'll try our best to get through as many questions as we can. Then, after 20 minutes, I'll bring the Q&A to an end, but as you know, that won't be the end of the session. To help you think through and apply the ideas you've heard, I'll ask you to join a 20-minute icebreaker session where you'll have 2 speed meetings with other attendees to discuss your thoughts on the content. I'll explain how to do that when we get there. But now, I would like to introduce our speaker for this session. Lewis Bollard leads Open Philanthropy's strategy for farm animal welfare. Prior to joining Open Philanthropy, he worked as policy advisor and international liaison to the CEO at the Humane Society of the United States. Prior to that, he was a litigation fellow, a law student, and an associate consultant at Bain & Company. He has a BA from Harvard University in social studies and a JD from Yale Law School. Now here's Lewis Bollard.
Hi, thanks for joining. With the world changing around us, I've been thinking a lot about how the present crisis and the upending of the world around it should affect how we think about the most effective ways to help animals, and particularly farm animals. Now, I definitely don't have all the answers, but I'd like to explore with you today. I'm particularly excited to explore in the questions and answers what this present moment could mean for the most effective ways to help animals. As often, I think that the Vox Future Perfect newsletter has put it most succinctly and clearly. They suggested a couple of weeks ago that this might be a golden opportunity to help animals. Now, I've heard in particular people suggest a couple of different ways that groups should be taking account of the current situation to pursue new opportunities to help animals. And so I'd like to consider some of the pros and cons of each of those approaches, some things we need to be careful of, but also some things that might present unique opportunities. So the first approach that's being discussed a bunch has been working to shut down or slow down slaughterhouses, at least temporarily. Now, there's a very clear public health basis for this. This map in the background here shows you the mapping of slaughterhouses and food processing plants with COVID outbreaks across the US. There have now been over 223 meat plants alone with COVID outbreaks, infecting about 25,000 workers, or 1 in 3 of the meat industry's workers. It's really an astounding number, and I'm sure it would be the case for public health benefits that there would be real merits to shutting down slaughter lines. There would also likely be benefits for workers. It's great to see that the plight of slaughterhouse workers has finally received the kind of media attention that it's been deserving of for a very long time. The question for us, though, of course, as animal advocates is, would this be good for animals? And I've seen advocates pointing to data like this to suggest that there may be a bigger opportunity here, one to strike at the heart of the industrial animal system, to pursue systemic change. Are they right? Well, sadly, I don't think so. This graph picks up where the last one ended and adds in chickens as well. Now, we've charted here the number of animals being slaughtered in the US on a weekly basis relative to last year's, the same week last year. And what you can see is that US slaughter numbers never really dipped for chickens, and for cows and pigs where they did dip, they're largely back to normal again. That's similar to what we've seen in China, Europe, and elsewhere around the world. Moreover, slaughterhouse shutdowns and even slowdowns are sadly very bad for animals. Because farmers already raise too many animals in a very confined space, and because they don't do a lot of advanced planning for crises like this, shutdowns leave them with a lot of animals that have nowhere to go. Now, what we've seen in China, India, Iran, the US, increasingly in Europe, is mass cullings of these animals on farm. And this is why this matters. This is a headline from the Daily Mail just a week and a half ago about a new undercover investigation by Direct Action Everywhere at a pig farm in Iowa, where they found that the workers were using a method called ventilation shutdown, where they literally just turn off the ventilators, pump in additional heat, and wait for the pigs to perspire from the heat. This took hours. Now, the reason why such horrendously cruel methods are being practiced, and we've seen globally the use of live burial in China, the use of live burial in Iran and other countries, the reason they're being pursued is because these farmers have far too many animals to provide individual care or individual deaths to any of them. So the best case scenario you can hope for is that they find perhaps an inert gas. Very few farmers, though, are willing to pay for the relatively expensive inert gases or claim that they have access to them. So you see a resort to this kind of killing for on-farm use. And so I do think that there may be an opportunity here to tie this kind of particularly horrendous cruelty and the mistreatment of workers and public health threats that this has exposed from industry to the brands that the meat industry sells their product to. So, for example, McDonald's is likely the largest customer for Tyson Foods. There's a Tyson VP for the McDonald's relationship. And we've seen throughout this crisis that Tyson has been perhaps the worst actor of all, having the highest number of case fatalities, actively lobbying the president to reopen plants when it wasn't safe to do so. And we're also seeing, as we've seen for years, evidence of animal cruelty at Tyson plant. And so this may be an opportunity to tie that more closely to brands like McDonald's that rely on Tyson as a supplier. The second opportunity that has been discussed is around publicizing the connection between pandemics and factory farming. You see here is an image from Bill Mayer's HBO show where he talked about the way in which factory farms, by confining a lot of immune suppressed animals with identical genetics into a very small space, create kind of the perfect breeding grounds for a pandemic. This was also part of the hook for this New York Times op-ed last month by Jonathan Safran Foer. You can see this received a lot of engagement in the comments. It was also trending on Twitter for a while. And so I think it's certainly quite possible that this messaging has an ability to reach new audiences and to get media attention that we wouldn't be able to get with a traditional animal-focused factory farming message. But in spite of that publicity, there's little evidence to date that people are making that connection between pandemics and factory farming. What you see here is Google Trends data looking at global searches for factory farming. Now, the result is the same if you look in the US or in other large markets. It's different if you look for the intensive animal farming topic, but the reason for that appears to be that in Portuguese, they're miscategorizing lockdowns as part of this topic. And so you're seeing a huge up spike due to that. But what you see in this data is little evidence that there is a huge uptick of public concern around factory farming, which might be surprising to those of us who are on Twitter constantly seeing things from our friends, from other people in the animal movement. But it's, I think, a good reminder that we can sometimes be in a news bubble as far as this information is concerned. There are also some risks. So what this rather poorly put together slide shows is two graphs from a recent Rethink Priorities survey in which they surveyed American adults on first their perceptions of animal activists and secondly their support for a ban on factory farming. And what they found was that exposing people to a message linking pandemics and factory farming not only did no better than a control message, just talking about factory farming, or indeed a baseline of giving no message at all, it actually did slightly worse in terms of support for ending factory farming, and substantially worse in terms of its effect on perceptions of animal advocates as accurate and truthful. I think this chart helps to explain why. This is from another survey of American adults, this one done by Faunalytics, again, within the last few months. And they read people a series of factual statements about the connections between COVID or pandemics and animals. And as you can see, most people rated those factual statements as false. Perhaps even more strikingly, when they asked people to describe an open-ended question, what had caused COVID to jump from animals to humans, only 16% of people mentioned the live animal markets, which are seemingly the current scientific consensus on where that jump likely happened. So what we're seeing is that people aren't even connecting COVID or pandemics to animals, let alone to factory farming. And here's another risk of pandemic messaging that we're not careful about. In this case, we're seeing a policy response from China, where they're responding to the perceived increased threat of zoonoses by pushing for greater consolidation toward large factory farms, which they perceive to be both more biosecure and easier to monitor than the many higher welfare, small backyard farms that have traditionally predominated in China. Now, I think that this trend is inevitable for many reasons, but it's still not something we want to actively speed up. However, I do think there's some positive potential here. So point first to the new EU farm to fork strategy, which specifically mentions that COVID-19 has demonstrated the fragility of the current industrial agriculture system and calls for more sustainable alternatives. More specifically, the plan calls for more funding for the development of plant-based alternatives and for higher animal welfare standards. And I also think there might be opportunities to broaden the discussion to cover food safety more broadly and the connection between food safety and animal welfare. Now, this connection isn't always direct. For example, in the current UK-US trade negotiations, chlorinated chicken has become a major concern of the UK public, seemingly based on pretty ill-founded food safety concerns. But there are some real animal welfare concerns here, which is that the use of chlorine by US slaughterhouses allows US chicken producers to maintain worse hygiene standards, and in particular, to not change the litter that the birds live on between flocks, as European producers do. Now, this likely leads to birds getting more burns and more blisters from the reused litter, which in turn causes pain and creates major welfare problems. For this slide, I mainly just wanted to get this image in. I came across this the other day in rereading Peter Singer's excellent biography of Henry Sparrow, Ethics into Action, which I highly recommend if you haven't had a chance to read it yet. Henry Sparrow was one of the early effective animal activists focused on corporate campaigns in particular. And this was a creative image that he got commissioned as part of a campaign against KFC in the 1990s. Now, despite the tenuous connection to my talk topic, I do think that this, again, is just worth considering that food safety may play a bigger role in animal welfare campaigns going forward. Related to that, I think there's an opportunity for plant-based meat companies to highlight the safety of their food products. So I was really struck by this quote that I came across in the Beyond Meat filings with the SEC when it IPO'd last year. In particular, Beyond Meat called out this one incident in 2017 where before any products made it out the door at one of their co-manufacturing facilities, some products were infected with salmonella. I find this so striking because Beyond Meat treated it as a big deal, recalling the product and even canceling its contract with the contract manufacturer. By contrast, if a conventional US chicken producer recalled all products infected with salmonella, it would have very few products to sell. For example, the USDA's safety target is that less than 15% of US chicken still has salmonella on it when it leaves the plant. So again, a real difference here between the safety standards that plant-based meat is holding itself to versus the safety standards that the meat industry has been accustomed to following. Which brings us to the third and final opportunity around the current situation, which is promoting plant-based meats as a potential solution to the fragility of the current industrial animal agriculture system. In particular, plant-based meat facilities have had no reported COVID outbreaks to date, likely because they're highly automated. And they've continued to be able to stock the shelves where meat producers have often failed. There's also some evidence from China that people switched to more plant-based options during the crisis, as this chart suggests. Now, it's hard to know, based on scant media reports, whether this was due to a scarce supply of meat or consumer concerns around its safety. But either way, I think it emphasizes the vulnerability of meat to this crisis and the greater resilience of plant-based foods. Still, we shouldn't get ahead of ourselves again. So this is from the same Fauna-Lytics survey as earlier, and the blue bars here indicate more likely, red indicates less likely, gray indicates neutral. And what you see is results very similar to what we see in normal times, which is roughly the same number of Americans saying they plan to eat more meat and less meat, more plant-based foods, less plant-based foods. So again, we shouldn't infer that there's been any big change in consumption here. This data is also consistent with that. It shows US retail sales of plant-based meat in green and their percentage of total meat market share in purple. Now you can see is the plant-based meat sales have been going very strong, but surprisingly perhaps their market share is actually down slightly. So we're not seeing a huge market takeover. That said, I think this is still an impressive result for plant-based meat. Given two of the leading brands, Beyond and Impossible, were almost entirely reliant on food service prior to this crisis, it's impressive to even be holding steady in the retail category. And I think we are starting to see some exciting new partnerships and launches come out of this. For instance, just within the last month, Beyond Meat has rolled out a new product in Starbucks in China, most recently with Yum Foods, and this is you're seeing an advertisement for Pizza Hut Beyond Meat in China, and also with a major distributor. And so I'm hopeful that we'll start to see more such partnerships. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Lewis, for that talk. Great job. And I see we've already had a number of questions submitted. So let's get started with the first. Lewis, welcome live to Virtual EA Global.
Thanks, Nathan. And hi, everyone.
Awesome. So let's get started. So do you think there should be more emphasis on the health and well-being of the workers in these industries, and potentially because that could be easier for the general public to understand and latch onto?
Yeah, so I think for the sake of the workers, there should certainly be attention to their plight. I think this has been overlooked for far too long. And I think it is certainly the case that it's been easier for the public to relate to. We've seen far more media attention to this than we normally see to the plight of animals within factory farms or slaughterhouses, and a lot more media attention than we've seen, for instance, to the mass killings of farm animals going on currently. So I think it's good there's that attention for workers, and I think it's true it gets more attention. I think, unfortunately, for animals and the solutions we want, they don't tend to be the same. So I think it's independently good to have workers' rights reforms. You know, in the case of the kinds of things that I think will make a real difference for workers, my sense is spacing people out, certainly, perhaps slowing down the line, which could help animals a bit. But otherwise, really just keeping plants shut for longer, maintaining better sanitation methods, all good ideas for workers, probably won't do a lot for animals. And I do think that as animal advocates first, we also need to keep thinking, what will be the consequences of actions for animals? And while I certainly think people should do things to help workers as well, I'm not sure this is going to be a silver bullet that's going to help animals as much at the same time.
Thank you. Yeah, that's too bad, but makes sense. Now, when people in general society talk about reasons to not eat meat or to eat less meat, they will often cite environmentalism or personal health benefits. But those are not obviously fundamentally about the animals. How concerned are you that technological advancements could render those concerns, environmentalism and personal health, ultimately ineffective as arguments against the consumption of animals?
Yeah, I've always felt mixed on the environmental and health arguments. I think there are couple of limitations to them. Clearly, they work with some people, and so I don't mean to say that people shouldn't, reduce their meat or intake or go vegan for health or environmental reasons. I think one problem is that they focus the action very much as one of individual consumer choice, where I think we want to be framing things more as a social movement and more as a moral imperative. I think another risk is that for a lot of people, they lead them away from red meat and toward white meat, toward chicken and fish, which probably are healthier, do probably have a smaller environmental footprint, but are much worse in terms of animal cruelty. And so I worry already on those grounds. In terms of the potential of technological advancement, if the sort of thing you're thinking of is reductions in emissions from animal agriculture, improvements in nutrition, I think that, could weaken those arguments further. I guess I think those arguments have always health and environmental arguments have always had a big weakness to them. And so I think all else equal, and all else isn't always equal, we should try and put the message about animals' well-being and suffering first.
Thank you. How worried do you think the animal advocacy movement should be about leaving a bad impression with the public for potentially trying to capitalize or take advantage of the COVID-19 pandemic and all the attendant hardship and tragedy that has come along with that? How can we push the issue but still seem genuine and not alienate the public?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and one I'm genuinely unsure about. I think there are different philosophies on this within the movement. So you see a group like People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. Their attitude is very much that all publicity is good publicity, and that to see social change, you need to stir things up, you need to create controversy, and that ultimately offending people is part of the cost of social progress. And so you see that in how they've responded to this crisis. They have been unashamed in seeking to capitalize on this. I tend to take a more, I guess, for want of a better word, conservative perspective on this. I don't want to needlessly offend people, and I do think that we want to maintain as large a coalition and as many allies as possible. So I do think we should be careful of that. I mean, I think the Rethink Priorities survey I mentioned in the presentation outlines some of the risks there, that messages could be seen as making us seem less accurate, less trustworthy, even if they're accurate messages. And I also don't think that it's clear that those messages are a lot more effective. I mean, I think one open question is perhaps they are better at getting media attention and getting kind of views. But it seems like those messages are less persuasive. And I also think those messages don't obviously lead that people should go vegan or that we should end factory farming. And so I think we need to be careful about making arguments that just seem good because they're against animal agriculture, they're hitting on animal agriculture, when we're less clear how that would actually translate into positive progress for animals.
Gotcha. Thank you. Well, changing pace a little bit, this next question is actually the most upvoted by our viewers. So at Open Philanthropy, have there been discussions regarding the potential overlap between animal advocacy and AI safety, like aligning the utility functions of AIs to consider animal welfare?
Yeah, so I saw this getting progressively upvoted, and I felt bad because I don't have a great answer to it. The short answer is that no, we typically keep our program areas pretty separate, and so we're not normally looking at the synergy between different areas. That said, I have had informal conversations with our AI team about it, and all of them I think are very sympathetic to animal suffering and do envisage futures where there isn't animal suffering. And I think two things to note. One thing is that a lot of the work at this point is focused on the existential risk aspect, reducing the risk of AI ending humanity. And one piece that goes with that is in many of the scenarios in which AI ends humanity, it would end animals as well. Or if it didn't end animals as well, it might leave wild animals without humans and without any ability to improve their welfare over time. The other aspect in terms of working on values, I think is something we've done a bit less of. But certainly the way that the people I work with view the alignment of values is those are values that include considerations and should be values that include considerations of animals as well as humans. So that's about as far as our discussions have gotten. I think there were some comments in the Slido thread from Vi, who works at Mercy for Animals in Hong Kong as an EA and looking at doing a group in the space. And I encourage you to contact him if you're interested.
Awesome, thank you. So a lot of questions actually still continuing to come in. I don't know if we'll be able to get to all of them, but potentially a somewhat related question next. What would you say is the current state of the welfare biology literature? And what questions in welfare biology could have large implications for animal welfare advocacy?
Just giving me all the easy questions today. So I would first, I should say, for people who are confused what the reference to welfare biology is about, it's a new field of scientific study that is being proposed, focused on improving the welfare of wild animals, and particularly free-roaming wild animals who aren't directly affected by human conduct. I would love to see more study in this field. It's very young. There aren't yet full-time scientists working on it. There are people sort of just publishing pieces here and there. I think the best place to go to get a sense of what's going on is the Wild Animal Initiative, is sort of the top group working in this space. In terms of what questions could have the largest implications for animal welfare advocacy, I mean, I think that on wild animal welfare, we're still looking to answer some of the most basic questions. So first, the question of how many wild animals are there of various types. We have some estimates on that, but we can get a lot more precise. But then really understanding the lives of those animals. So understanding what aspects of their life have positive welfare, what aspects have negative welfare, how negative is it? For instance, understanding in what ways different species of animals die, what portion die from hunger, from starvation, from disease, from predation, and how long do those experiences take? What indications do we have about those experiences? I think another thing that we've just been looking into a little bit lately is looking at fluctuations within populations. I think all else equal, you would expect stable populations of wild animals to have much higher welfare than populations that are fluctuating rapidly up and down, meaning huge numbers of animals are dying off, huge numbers more being born and then more dying off. So yeah, I mean, there are many more questions. I could probably talk about this for an hour, but I encourage people to check out the Wild Animal Initiative.
Cool. Well, next up is a section of questions on how individuals can contribute to the movement and where their efforts would be most valuable. So to start off, can you just begin by summarizing the current evidence on what type of interventions are most effective to help farmed animals?
Yeah, so another big one. I think that people should definitely check out some of the literature on Animal Charity Evaluators website. Sentience Institute as well has done some summaries on this. And I also put out a research newsletter about every month looking at the evidence on particular interventions typically. So just to give a very quick overview, I'd say that we generally have much less evidence than you have in an area like global public health and development. It's still a very young field, farm animal advocacy, and an even younger field in terms of really studying the impact of interventions today. I think we do have some sense of track record just from work over the last 10, 20 years. And our view of some of that track record is that there is a really impressive track record of corporate reforms and corporate campaigns seeking new corporate animal welfare policies. In certain parts of the world, not everywhere, but in certain parts, there have been some really exciting progress on legislative reform. And we've also seen some interesting institutional reforms and interesting evidence of movement building. I think maybe where we haven't seen as much progress are on things like vegan advocacy. That's not to say it can't work. I think many advocates in the movement came in through vegan advocacy. We haven't seen a significant portion of the population in any country going vegan or seeing huge changes in that. And I think similarly, that could be said of meat reduction advocacy. Again, we can't say it doesn't work, but we haven't seen the large scale kind of changes that people might have hoped for.
So you mentioned corporate reforms. Another question highly related to that is, with the economic impact of COVID-19, do you see a lot of risk that companies may not follow through on the commitments that they had previously made? Is there any way that we can know that at this point?
Yeah, that's a real risk. So, we've already seen a number of companies firing their corporate social responsibility departments. We've seen retailers say, we're not interested in animal welfare right now. We're busy feeding the world. And we've seen fast food chains saying, oh, we're in such financial distress, we can't meet these commitments anymore. So there's a real risk of that. I think the good news on that front is first that we've already seen a lot of progress to date. So one example is as of just before of COVID, 26% of US hens were cage-free. That's up from 6% before these campaigns started. So we already saw basically a 5x increase driven by corporate pledges. Similarly, we've seen similar progress in Europe. In fact, larger scale progress in Europe. In the UK, in Spain, and France, significant increases in the percentage of hens cage-free, and actually increasingly in Europe, percentage increases in chickens being kept in higher welfare conditions. So I think we're seeing some progress already. Another good thing is most of these timelines allow for them to complete these transitions between 2024 and 2026. And unless COVID sticks around for far longer, or the economy is in a terrible state for a long time, I think this is going to start to look like a pretty flimsy excuse by 2024, 2025 for not fulfilling pledges. But absolutely, we're going to need to keep pressure on companies. I think lots of companies are constantly looking for excuses to back out of their commitments, and I think that we need to make clear to them that that's not acceptable.
Thank you. So you had also mentioned legislative or policy initiatives as a possible channel. What do you think are the most promising legislative or policy actions that EAAs can take in both the short and longer term?
Yeah, so I actually think this is a very exciting time for this. Typically in the past, I think I've said on legislative action that I'm somewhat pessimistic, but we've seen a couple of developments recently. So one is that the British government is interested in adopting a set of animal welfare reforms post-Brexit, and I think it seems very achievable to see an end to enriched layer hen cages in the UK and farrowing crates for pigs. So basically the end of all extreme confinement practices in the UK. I think it seems very feasible to see subsidies tied to animal welfare improvements, so subsidies for higher welfare farming methods. The government's already talked about doing that. And the third area, which I think is feasible, but it's going to be a really tough fight, is securing standards on imported products too, so that they should also have to meet UK animal welfare standards. And that would be a really powerful precedent if that was adopted in the upcoming trade negotiations. I think in other parts of the world, there are exciting things too. So in the United States, just this last week, the Colorado State Senate passed out a ban on battery cages and the sale of caged hens in the state. That's now sitting on the governor's desk. The governor seems very likely to sign it. That's the latest in a series of states that have passed similar bills: Washington, Michigan, Oregon, and driven heavily by the threat of ballot measures in those states. But I think it's really heartening. And I think more broadly, if you look across other governments, the European Union just came out with a document in the last month saying they're going to reconsider their animal welfare policies. The Canadian government is revising its codes. The Australian and New Zealand governments, I think, have been doing something similar recently. French government, German government, both promising to ban castration for piglets and the mass culling of baby chicks. So seeing a lot going on this front. Obviously, it's always far short of what needs to happen, but I do think it's a real testament to the sustained engagement of advocates in the political process. And so I would encourage people, wherever you are, to look into engaging in that. And it's often the case that the things that groups are talking about the most are ultimately unachievable. So, we're not going to get a ban on factory farming anywhere anytime soon. But I do think that just for politicians hearing from people how much of a concern factory farming is and how much they care about farm animal welfare, I think those things cumulatively can make a large difference over time toward getting these relatively incremental reforms that can build on one another.
So another question that's been upvoted a lot and kind of follows up on what you were just saying in terms of factory farming not being banned anytime soon. When it comes to these legislative and policy initiatives, how ambitious do you think advocates should be in their asks? In other words, should they ask for factory farming bans when they call their legislators, even though they know it won't happen? Or should they be asking for something more specific and more incremental?
Yeah, so this is a hotly debated topic, and I think I totally understand people have different opinions on this. My personal opinion is that when you ask for all or nothing, you normally get nothing, and that incremental advocacy has been a lot more effective. I think one thing a lot of people don't realize about the animal advocacy movement is it's been around in some form since about the 1850s, 1860s, and during much of that time, it took a very absolutist approach. So, for instance, a large portion of the movement was focused on anti-vivisection, anti-animal testing work, and they weren't calling for reforms. They were just calling for the abolition of animal testing. And in over 100 years of advocacy and calling for abolition repeatedly, doing large demonstrations, protests, they didn't achieve it anywhere. I mean, it truly was just we have a 100-year track record of failure. And on animal testing, what really made the difference was when Henry Sparrow, who I briefly mentioned in the presentation, when he entered in the 1980s, and he has a great quote about there being this 100-year track record of failure and needing to revisit things, and he started pushing incremental asks. And so I strongly encourage people interested in kind of the background of part of the movement to read that book I referenced, Ethics into Action by Peter Singer. But I also think just looking at more recent evidence that we've seen incremental asks win. We haven't seen absolutist asks win. I think that the only place you could argue we won was in Switzerland. There is a ban on large factory farms, not a ban on all factory farms, but a ban on large factory farms. What has resulted in is just the offshoring of Swiss animal agriculture. So they now import most of their animal products. I think that we can often be deceived by survey results. So, I mean, there was a great survey result from Senience Institute saying most people wanted to ban factory farming. I think that what you're mainly seeing there is that most people are not thinking about factory farming or slaughterhouses, and like to say yes, whatever. But when it's actually put into a legislative process or even a ballot measure process, you see that support starts to subside pretty quickly when people see the trade-off. So, I'd say if people feel very strongly that I'm wrong about that, I would love for them to go out there and try and ban factory farming somewhere and start somewhere small. Like, I mean, I don't mean that just in a mean-spirited way. Like, I really do mean, go and find whatever the most sympathetic community, the smallest one you can find is. See if you can pass something, and then from there get bigger. And a model that some people might cite would be the fur bans, which have had some success recently. And I could go on that topic for a long time, but I would argue a lot of what drove that was ultimately incremental pledges that brought us to the point where we are today.
Thank you. So one more question from somebody named Bruce Friedrich about priorities, and then we'll move on to a couple final questions about your path into the movement and advice for others that might like to follow your path. But Bruce's question is, what do you think about lobbying for state and or federal funding for alternative protein R&D?
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. So Bruce's group, the Good Food Institute, has been doing some exciting work on that, both in the US and I think in Europe as well. We're starting to see a number of governments put money into various parts of this. So the Singaporean government has invested a bunch into plant-based and cell-based meat research. The Canadian government putting a lot of money into plant-based protein crops. The European Union has started putting money into this from an environmental angle. So I think it's a great idea, particularly given animal agriculture across the board just has huge public subsidies in terms of research and development. So in the US, just the publicly funded ag research budgets in the billions annually. And so I think it's a very reasonable request to ask to get just a small portion of that to go to plant-based and cell-based. And given how scarce our philanthropic capital is, that can be really transformative in the space. So yeah, I'm excited about that possibility.
Yeah, me too, certainly. Okay, just a couple minutes to go, probably even a little under 2 minutes left in our time here. So let's try to do these last two questions quickly. Just tell us briefly your story. You started in consulting, made your way to animal advocacy. What advice would you give to recent graduates or young EAs generally who are looking to follow a similar path?
Yeah, so my personal advice is don't go into consulting, but get advice from lots of people, because some people will say you absolutely should, and people have very different views on these. For myself, honestly, consulting was what I did because I graduated in the middle of the last financial recession, and it was hard to get a job that I was passionate about, and it was relatively easy to get a business consulting job, and so I ended up doing that for a year. Honestly, it was kind of a waste of time. I don't think it's been very helpful ever since. But I know for some people, my brother's a business consultant. He loves it. I know plenty of people who have used their consulting background to do good things for plant-based and cell-based companies and so on. So if you are a consultant currently, great, find a way to leverage that to do good. If you're not, maybe think about some other possibilities.
All right, thank you. And final question, aside from the Open Phil Animal Welfare newsletter, what publications or other resources would you recommend that animal advocates read to stay current?
Yeah, good question. So, I mean, first of all, there's a lot of good people to follow on Twitter and online, I think. I actually rely a bunch on Google News alerts. I wish I had a better alternative, but that works for me. And then there are a couple of really good newsletters out there. So the ones that first come to mind, I'm going to leave people out. The But Can They Suffer newsletter, the Future Food newsletter by Michelle Klar, which is about Asian plant-based and cell-based food. I'll take a look and look for some others and maybe throw that out in my next newsletter, because I think that's a great question.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Louis, and thank you to everybody who watched and submitted questions. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for Q&A, and we weren't able to get to every last question, but we do very much appreciate your time and your answers. That does conclude the Q&A portion of this session. So a virtual round of applause to Louis Bollard for joining us. But don't go away yet, because discussing new ideas with other people can be a great way to better understand them. And so we're going to use the next 20 minutes of this session for a couple of short speed meetings with other attendees. If you check the session description below this video, you'll find a link to an icebreaker session where we're going to gather for those meetings. So please click on that link now, and a new host will meet you on the other side. Thanks again to Louis Bollard. Thanks again to all of you for watching, and we'll see you soon.